So here we are at this, segregated cemetery, and the earliest grave is actually from the 1840s, and then the most recent grave, or the last interment, is 1964.
Welcome to another episode of Curious. I'm your host, Sharon Latimer Mosley. On today's show, we speak to the founder of the Friends of the African American Cemetery in Rye, Dave Thomas. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Dave?
I'm very good.
Okay, so tell me where the African American Cemetery is, because when I went to find it, it was very difficult to find because it seems like it's in the back of the cemetery. It's a funny way that you have to get to it.
And that's really part of the story and the history of the cemetery itself, because it is adjacent to the Greenwood Union Cemetery on 215 North Street in Rye. So the Greenwood Union Cemetery is a large cemetery. It's a historic cemetery. It goes back to the early 1800s. And then the African American Cemetery is directly behind it, adjacent to 95. So as you go in the cemetery proper, you make a left after the office, drive all the way to the end, make a right, and then you'll see a sign for the cemetery.
Okay. So how did you come to find the cemetery?
It was a meeting, actually, of a group in Portchester. After the contentious suit suing the village of Portchester about election law, a person got together, Supervisor Joe Carvin, he was a former supervisor, and wanted to create a group where there would be some understanding between Portchester residents. And one of the things the group did was, in the beginning, you told the story of your ancestry and how you came to America, how your family came to America. And since the group was diverse, a lot of different stories came out. Now, one of the participants, Tom Kister, who is the current head of the Portchester Rye NAACP, mentioned something about an African American cemetery in the city of Rye. And that was the first I had heard of it. I'm a Westchester resident all my life. I was born and raised in Mount Vernon. And we all know Rye is a very affluent community, so I was saying, how can this be? And as I learned more about it, it was actually deeded to the town of Rye, which is the first municipal entity in this area, back in the 1860s.
Who deeded it to Rye, do you know?
Elizabeth and Underwood Halstead, I believe his name. I'd have to look, but I believe that they were Quakers. And they lived in Rye. They actually lived on Milton Road. You know where there's a deli. If anybody's familiar with Milton Road, there's a deli there, and there's a stone wall in front of that deli, and that's the actual stone wall, the original stone wall of their mansion that was in that area.
Does anyone know why they deeded that land for African Americans to be buried?
Well, that was part of the Quaker religion. They did not believe in slavery. They believed, of course, that we're all God's children. And they realized that African Americans didn't have a proper place to be buried. If you were a resident of the town of Rye and you owned slaves, those slaves were buried on the property or in the family plot, depending on, how close you were to them. But there were also freed African Americans in the town of Rye at that time and before. So those people did not have an actual burial location. So the Halstead said, we're going to deed this land to the town specifically for that.
And that also included Mamaroneck residents, is that true?
Well, when you say the town of Rye, that was part of the town of Rye.
Ah, I see.
A portion of Mamaroneck, which we now call Rye Neck, was originally part of the town of Rye. So there are actually people who are buried there who come from all over the county.
Okay.
Families from White Plains, New Rochelle, Greenberg, all over. So it wasn't just, Rye residents. It was just any African Americans who had a connection with the town, whether through church or because there were very few African American churches.
Now, it didn't look like it looks now. What did it take to get it to the state that it is now? What did it look like before it looked like it looks now?
Well, I can only go by stories because my first visit was roughly 10 years ago. Now, the ownership of the cemetery was contested. And when I say contested, it was contested in a sort of weird way that you wouldn't think it was. When the village of, I should say, the city of Rye split from the town of Rye back in 1942, I believe, they did not want the ownership of that cemetery.
Why? Did they say why?
Well, that's under contention.
Oh, okay.
And then the town of Rye really didn't want the ownership of the cemetery. So they actually had to go to court to determine who actually owned the cemetery. And it was after years, I believe, of litigation, it turned out that the town of Rye retained ownership of the cemetery along with part of Ryetown Park. So all of those two things sort of, that's what happened when the city of Rye split from the town.
So were all the headstones in the condition they are now, or who cleaned it up? Was there a lot of weeds and overgrowth there?
Oh, yes. According to Mr. Kistner, and he was the one who actually went there in the 70s, the weeds were as high as 4 feet.
Oh, my goodness.
So most of the headstones were obscured at that time. And then the actual former town supervisor, Robert Morabito, actually endeavored to go and clean up the cemetery.
Oh.
So he sent his maintenance crews in, the workers from the town of Rye, to actually cut the grass, and that revealed all the other headstones and the extent of the cemetery itself. The cemetery is surrounded by a stone wall. It's not, it's just like field stone. And the wall was revealed, the smaller headstones were revealed, and then there were also stones in the ground that were just sort of grouped together that they discovered, and that they assumed that that was the markers that they used for some of the people who couldn't afford a headstone.
Well, I know from my own experience that African Americans used to use stones as markers. So you would have to, the older family member would have to know who was buried there because there was no headstone, or someone chiseled the headstone themselves. And
that's what we think happened.
Oh.
But over the years, the stones were actually covered by, the growth of flora and dirt and just time. And some of those stones are now buried, and we're not sure where they are.
Now, I understand the Boy Scouts helped you. Or was it a Boy Scout, or the Boy Scouts helped the Friends of the African American Cemetery in some way?
It was one particular Boy Scout in particular. His name is Daniel Vitaliano. His Eagle Scout project was to document the burials in the African American cemetery. And this young man went out, and he went to all of the clerk's offices and the halls of records and wherever he could find information about the then called colored cemetery, and compiled this list of those burials that were there.
Wow.
And it was from this list that we find out there are over 379 people that we know of that are interred at the site.
Oh, my goodness. And so how many have you found?
Well, we've identified, and there are only about 80 headstones. The rest are unknown or covered over.
Oh, my goodness, that's terrible. So you did bring a couple of photographs of some African Americans who were buried there. And could you tell us a little about some of the people who are buried there?
Absolutely.
So who are we going to put up first?
This is Samuel Eshman Bell.
Okay.
Now, he was a resident of Mamaroneck and also a Civil War veteran who served with the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. That was the famous regiment from the movie Glory. Mm-hmm. And he had to actually travel from here to Massachusetts to enlist.
How did he get, is there any record of how he traveled or how he got there, or there's no record of that?
That probably in his story held by the family somewhere, but we suppose, you know, there was rail service, and there was, of course, the Boston Post Road.
Oh.
And he was he was a freed African American in this area. His family owned a farm, so he probably took his horse and rode up there.
And we also have another picture of is it his daughter?
This is his daughter, Harriet Maria Bell. Now, the interesting story about Harriet is that she was engaged to a young man named Frederick Smith. And they were planning to be married. And her descendant, who is Carol Yabosi, is one of the premier friends of the African American Cemetery, has actual letters that she wrote to Frederick during their courtship.
Where did she find those?
They were actually in a trunk in the basement of her ancestral home here in Mamaroneck. Now, Providence supplied us with a basement that was perfect for the preservation of artifacts. It was dry, it was cool, and it was not infested.
Oh my gosh.
So in these trunks was a treasure trove of not only family documents from the 1800s, but actual clothing, dry goods, because the family owned a dry goods store and ran a dry goods store here in Mamaroneck, and all sorts of other implements of everyday life for the Bell and Potter families, as it were.
Is there any evidence of what church they may have gone to? Because some of the churches here in Mamaroneck are old.
They were members of the Barry Avenue Church.
Oh, Barry Avenue. I lived on Barry Avenue.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, that's amazing.
A lot of the residents, or a lot of the people who are interned at the site were Barry Avenue parishioners.
That's pretty exciting to me. I used to take photographs of that church all the time.
And actually, the founder of Barry Avenue Church is buried at the cemetery.
And what was his name?
Now you're going to stump me, because he is a ancestor of Robinette Robinson. And forgive me if I can't remember his name.
It's okay, because I believe you talked about it in the video, so I'll see if I can put a little segue there about that particular person.
Robert Purdy, thank you. Robert Purdy was an escaped slave from the South who came up to Scarsdale. They had a family home in Scarsdale. And he started this church here, and he would commute from Scarsdale up here to hold services and to be part of the community here at the Barry Avenue Church when it was in its original location.
Where was this? What was his original location?
I think it was a few blocks away. The church you see now is the second church. The first church was burned down in a fire, unfortunately.
Oh. So who else do we have?
Let's see. This is one of my favorite photographs. This is a photograph of James Hip Watson, and you can see why they called him Hip. He is an ancestor of Robinette Robinson and Surya Peterson. If you know anything about Westchester, you know Surya. And he was a teamster. And
explain what a teamster is
now,
for people who don't know.
In those days, teamsters were originally, they drove a wagon with a team of horses. That's where the name comes from. But at that particular time in the 20s and 30s, they actually drove a motorized vehicle, but they were still called teamsters. And he dressed up and he was a motorcycle enthusiast. He was actually a member of the Northernite Riders, which was an interracial motorcycle club here in Westchester in the 1920s and 30s. And there are actually pictures of the group in the White Plains Library. Now that picture, and it was told that every Easter Sunday, he owned two motorcycles. He owned an Indian and a Harley Davidson. And the Harley Davidson was the good bike. And he would dress up in top hat and tails and drive around on Easter Sunday every year.
I like him
he was
already.
a fixture. He was a very dapper young man, and to the way Robinette tells it, he was always clean. So it's just a great photo, a great story. Now, tragically, Mr. Watson died on Christmas Eve after being struck by a car on one of his motorcycles.
Wow.
And he's buried in unmarked graves. He's one of the...
Really?
Yes, he's one of those that do not have a headstone at the cemetery.
There's no plot map of who's buried there at all?
A map was created by the WPA. But it only shows the veterans.
Oh, and where is that map? Is that...
I actually have a copy of the map.
Can you also get it from the WPA records in Washington, or no?
Well, actually, the Westchester Historical Society has a copy of the map itself.
They do.
And I believe I put one up on the website for the town of Rye.
Huh, that's
Now,
very interesting.
that map, the actual list, there was a list, and this is the story goes. Robert Brown, who was the first president of the NAACP in Portchester and Rye, had the actual burial list.
Oh.
And he lived on that house on Midland Avenue that is right adjacent to the community center, the park that's there. That was just torn down a couple of years ago.
Wow.
And the contents were basically junked, except for some of his stuff that John Rivas, who is famous in Portchester, member of the NAACP in Portchester and Rye, he actually has some of it. So we haven't gone through it. So I'm hoping that someone somewhere has this list.
I hope that you digitize it in some way so that it's available, so some families don't live here anymore, and they have information or pictures or written material that would be great for the collection.
Well, everything that I receive now is digitized. And I put it up every once in a while on our Facebook page, which is called Friends of the African American Cemetery. And the pictures and the announcements and things like that I put up there. So it's a repository, but at some point I'm going to create a real archive of this material.
Okay. So we have one more photograph, is that correct?
This is Henry Woods. Now, if you look at this photo, he almost looks like a child, but he was actually in the, I believe, the 65th Regiment in New York, if I read that correctly. And it looks like, and I believe he was sort of like a drummer boy or an aide, or I'm not sure if he actually served in combat. But this picture is actually in the National Archives. And it's one of the few pictures of African American soldiers that we have by name. And he's buried at the site as well.
Oh, this is so exciting to me.
It's been very exciting to me as well. It's really one of those things that I sort of fell into, but it has enriched my life and changed my thinking of history and where I am and how African Americans and other people are really part of this country.
So I went to one of your lectures at the J Heritage House. How have they supported you in your project?
The J Heritage House and Suzanne Cleary have been just the greatest supporters we have. We have a common interest, which is the history of Westchester County. And the history of African Americans, one of the most famous African Americans in Westchester County history was a slave for the J family. His name was Caesar Valentine. And Suzanne was always curious about Mr. Valentine. He's actually pictured in one of the portraits of the mansion itself. He's a small figure with blind Peter, who was a descendant of the J family, of John Jay. And he was a slave at the J Heritage, at the J site, until his death. And he was freed, but they kept him on and paid him, I believe. Please don't quote me. Suzanne would know more. But the funny thing about it is that the same Carol Ubosi had a Bible, her family Bible. And when she was going through it, there was a notation written that mentioned a Caesar Valentine and his marriage to another person. And we were thinking, was this the same Caesar Valentine? And then Suzanne got involved and said that might have been his son, who was also named Caesar Valentine.
Well, you know, the Mamaroneck Library has excellent archives for the slave records with people's names in it and where they lived. So if people are interested in studying genealogy, they might want to start at their own public library.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Mount Vernon Public Library, the White Plains Public Library.
Excellent resources.
Those are resources, yes.
Now, I want to ask you, how does one become a friend of the African American Cemetery, and what are the things that you need most?
Well, it's a very informal group. A friend of the African American Cemetery is someone who shows up and is interested in the cemetery itself and what it represents to our community and to the history of this country. What we need, it's very little. We need some hard work. One of the things we're planning to do, and we have a draft plan, is to maintain the cemetery. Every year on Memorial Day and Veterans Day, I hold a small ceremony out at the site. And I looked at the headstones, and I'm saying to myself, you know, it would be nice if we could somehow maintain this cemetery, because I found that there were pictures taken in the 70s of headstones. And I'm saying to myself, wow, I've never seen that name. And what had happened was the name had worn off.
Yeah.
So the only record of who's buried there is from a picture from the 1970s. So what I've endeavored to do is to go in and care for the remaining headstones and to clean them, to remove the lichen, to remove the soot and dust and creatures that live on them, so that at least we can see what these were. And also, some of them are leaning, and some of them have fallen over, and some have even broken.
Now, do you need people to also research, or you've got that under control?
No, I absolutely don't. Research is something that is serendipitous at this site. And when I say that, is that every year I do a ceremony. Someone approaches me beforehand and says, hey, I have people buried here. Here's their story. And if I'm very lucky, they'll have a picture of the person who's buried there.
Wow. That's pretty amazing.
It is, and it's very moving for me as a sort of keeper of this cemetery, because every year I sit and I worry 2 or 3 weeks out, what am I going to say? How am I going to make this interesting? And these things just come. And sometimes I'll be looking somewhere and I'll find something very interesting. But other times people will pop up. And that's how I got the photos that you see. And that's how we learned about the descendants and what they did, and the Boy Scout. There was a Girl Scout, Anna K. Smickle, whose Silver Star project was to put up the kiosk at the cemetery.
Oh, yes, you have a kiosk. And tell us a little bit about the kiosk.
Anna Kay and her stepfather researched the list of the burials from Daniel, and they actually did some in-depth things, and they commissioned this kiosk, a 3-sided kiosk at the site, with pictures and stories and text to show the notables that are buried at the cemetery and the more interesting stories.
That is so. Oh, and I have to add, if you're going to go in the summertime, make sure you have your mosquito spray.
Yes, and if you go in the wintertime, wear your gloves because it does get chilly out there.
Yeah, yeah. It's pretty loud out there as well.
Yes, being next to the highway is sort of problematic, but it never deters from the site itself or what the site means. And, you know, we had a discovery that outside of the cemetery.
Outside of the cemetery?
Yes, in the Greenwood Union part, and far in the back near the highway, was the last resting place of Alice B. Russell, who was the second wife of Oscar Micheaux.
Really?
The famous black filmmaker, yes. And she was she directed, she starred, and she wrote a lot of the films that they both were participated in. And if you go back and see some of the films, you'll actually see Alice Russell.
Wow.
And there were two residents of Portchester and it was once again Tom Kistner who reminded people that she was buried there. And they got together some funds and they got her a headstone.
That would be a nice little summer project for some college students or museum students who are interested in curating.
Oh, it's there's so much out there that I would really like people to get involved in, and one of the things and the reason why I'm here is to spread the word about the cemetery and hopefully draw in this interest.
Okay, so how can people get more information? I don't want you to leave without giving that information, and perhaps you can come back and tell us if you found some new people or more information on some of the people who are buried there.
That would be my pleasure, and the best way to get involved is to go to the Facebook page, which is Friends of the African American Cemetery. You can message me on the page. I monitor it every once in a while. I don't post as much as I want. I don't want to put too much on there. But that's a great way to get in touch with me, and I will always get back to anyone who needs information on the site.
Well, Dave, thank you for coming. This has been an interesting conversation, and I hope that everyone comes out and supports Dave and the cemetery by volunteering or donating. And thank you again for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
Good night.
Samuel Bell, who was a African-American Civil War veteran, and he was with the 54th Massachusetts, made famous in the movie Glory. His wife, his daughter, two daughters and son are buried at this plot.